Good morning, everybody. Today, I have been asked to tell you the story of St. Christopher. This is the patron saint that we honor, and so I think it's a really important story to learn about. His special day, his feast day, was yesterday, the 25th of July. And so St. Christopher's represents a great story about how we are to live as Christians. This is a statue that is in my office, and it was given to me, I think, by George Milner. And you can see that St. Christopher was a big, strong, strapping kind of a guy. He was almost a giant of a man when he grew up. And he had the mission to serve the most powerful force in the world, the most powerful ruler he could find. And so for this story, I just want to let you know that his name was not always Christopher. His name originally was Reprobus. And so to tell the story, we do this in the green and growing season after Pentecost. And Reprobus looks like this for our story. And again, he was on the mission to serve the most powerful force in the world. And so in his journeys along the road, he wanted to go to the king's house. And so he arrives at the castle and he pounds on the door and he says, "I demand to see the king." And the king came out and he said, "Are you the most powerful ruler in the world?" And the king said, "I am." And so Reprobus kneeled before the king and promised that he would serve him. And so for years he served the king. And one day the king had some minstrels and some musicians in, and they were dancing and they were singing stories. And in the stories they talked about the devil or Satan. And every time they mentioned Satan, the king crossed himself. And so Reprobus asked the king, he says, "Why do you do that gesture?" And he says, "I do that gesture because Satan is very bad, and Satan can have power over us." And so Reprobus said, "Is Satan more powerful than you?" And he said, "I fear that he is." And so Reprobus said, "Then I shall serve the devil." And he left the king, and he went down the road, and he journeyed for 7 days and 7 nights, looking to find the devil. And suddenly, there was a man who came up beside him and asked if he could walk with Reprobus. And Reprobus said, "Sure, you can walk with me if you want." And he said, "Well, what are you doing?" He says, "I am looking for the most powerful ruler in the world. I am looking for the devil." And the man said, "You have found him." And Reprobus looked in his eyes, and he could tell that this, in fact, was the devil. And so he bowed before the devil and he said, "I will serve you." And so off they went on their journeys. And the journeys he had with the devil were much more exciting than the ones he had with the king, because they rattled men's souls. And at some points, the devil could show him all the kingdoms of the world. But one day, as they were walking along, there was a cross that they came upon. And he noticed that the devil went around the shadow of the cross in his travels. And so he asked the devil, "Why do you go around the cross, that shadow of that cross?" And the devil said, "That is the cross of Christ. And so I go around it." And he said, "Are you afraid of the cross of Christ?" He said, "It is true that Christ will ultimately defeat me. And so I go around that shadow." And Reprobus asked the devil, "Is Christ more powerful than you?" And he said, "I fear he is." And Reprobus was mad that he had deceived him all this time, proclaiming that he himself was the strongest force in the whole world. And so Reprobus left the devil and he went on his travels to look for Christ. And ultimately, after traveling for years without finding him, he came across a hut. And so hungry, he went into the hut and he spoke to a man, an old man. And the old man fed him and said, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I am looking for the Christ." And the old man said, "Oh, he is here." And Reprobuse said, "Are you he?" And the old man said, "No, I am not he. But I know where you can find him. This is what I want you to do. Let me feed you. And then I will send you down to the river's edge. There's been a ferry boat that has smashed that used to carry people across the river. But if you, in the meantime, can repair the ferry boat and help people get across, you will find Christ." And so, Reprobuse ate, became strong, and then he took that journey down to the river's edge. And there he found the ferry boat had been smashed in a million pieces and there's no way to fix it. So he decided that, I am big and I am strong and I am patient because I want to serve Christ. And so he decided that he himself would shoulder anybody that needed to cross the river and he would get them to the other side. And so he did this for years, back and forth, ferrying people who needed safety in crossing the river. He lived in a little hut near the river's edge. And one night, the weather was so bad that he decided that he needed to go inside and rest. And so he went inside his hut. And there he laid down his staff and he prepared himself some soup. And as he was drinking the soup, he heard this knock on the door, despite all the howling of the wind. And he opened the door, and there was this mighty gale that came in, and he didn't see anybody. So he closed the door, and he went back to his seat and began to eat his soup. And then he heard a knock again, and so he went to the door, but he could tell that the knock came from low, and he looked down, and there was this little boy, all in ragged clothes, looking very tired and hungry. And so he ushered the little boy into his hut. And he gave the little boy the rest of his soup. And the little boy just lapped it up like he was so hungry. And then the child said to Reprobuse, "I need to cross the river." And Reprobuse told him, "It is too dangerous to cross tonight." And he says, "I need to cross the river tonight. Will you help me?" And Reprobuse said, "Look, son, we can cross in the morning." And the little boy put his hand on Reprobuse's knee and said, "I need to cross tonight. I will go myself if you cannot take me." And so Reprobuse saw how determined he was, and he put the little boy on his shoulder. And he took them out to the riverbank, and they scrambled down in the dark. And the river was just wild and flowing, and he stepped in, and the boy was light as a feather. But as they were going across and getting deeper and deeper into the stream, all of a sudden, the boy was so heavy. It was like a sack of lead on his back, and he was losing his step and his grip, and so he used his staff to steady him. There were logs floating by and wind and howling, and he was going under, and he could barely get to the other side, and he just sort of fell onto the other side. And the little boy scrambled off his shoulders and grabbed him by the hair and pulled him up onto the land. And when Reprobuse looked up, he saw the little lad. He was glowing. And he said, "You weighed so much. I do not understand." And the little boy said, "I am the Christ. You carried me on your shoulders as I carried the weight of the world." And because you have carried the Christ of love, even at the potential of death, you have now served the most powerful force, love. And so Reprobuce, the child, said, I give you a new name. You have carried the Christ, and you will be called Christopher, the Christ bearer. And that is the end of the story. Pretty powerful, huh? Of that whole story, I wonder, which part did you like the best? And then, did you pick up maybe an idea of what is the most powerful force in the whole world? Wow. And finally, I leave you with this question. We call ourselves Christophers. How do we live into that name? That's a good question for the weekend. So, you know, we celebrate St. Christopher's in our service today, and so I encourage you and your family to look at the pictures and see what you notice in here. See if there's any hidden figures. See if this doesn't look like something mystical and magical and wonderful. And the last thing I want to show you is that one of your Godly Play teachers, Anne Jacoby, she brought me this from Europe. And this is another image of St. Christopher. And you'll notice this very strong man with a staff and the Christ child on his shoulders. All right, y'all. Have a good weekend. Blessings.